Okay, welcome everyone to Iran, the US, and Israel. How did we get here? A webinar organized by the National Iranian American Council and the Massachusetts Peace Action Education Fund. Thank you to our co-sponsors, Center for International Policy, Friends Committee on National Legislation, Just Foreign Policy, Military Families Speak Out, About Face Northeast, and Veterans for Peace, Boston. I'm Cole Harrison, Administrative Director of the MAPA Education Fund and staff organizer for our Gaza, Israel, Mideast Peace Campaign. This event is not being live streamed, but it is being recorded, and we will send out a recording of the event to all of you after it is finished. Supporters of US-led regime change in Iran have launched an online attack against Massachusetts Peace Action Education Fund, calling on us to cancel this event. We have received a wave of death threats and coordinated online harassment campaigns targeting organizers, panelists, and partners of the upcoming discussion. Their intent is to disrupt our expert panel on US-Iran-Israel relations. We strongly condemn these cowardly attacks on freedom of speech. However, these death threats have created a credible and immediate safety risk, and as a result, organizers decided to shift the event from an in-person gathering in Cambridge, as we originally planned, to this virtual format today. MAPA-EF supports self-determination in all countries, including Iran. It is our view that Iranians alone should determine the government of their country. The US government should have no role in deciding the future of Iran. President Trump should stop threatening to attack Iran, and he should end the US policy of regime change in Iran, and he should end US sanctions on Iran, which have greatly damaged Iran's economy and hurt its people. I'm proud to announce our three expert panelists. Negar Mortazavi is an award-winning journalist and commentator, editor and host of the Iran podcast, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and non-resident scholar at the Middle East Policy Council in Washington, D.C. She has been covering Iranian and Middle Eastern affairs as well as U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East for over a decade. She holds a master's degree from Brandeis University and a bachelor's from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Jamal Abdi is the president of the National Iranian American Council and the executive director of NIAC Action. He has served in this role since 2018. Prior to joining NIAC as policy director in 2009, he was a policy advisor on foreign policy, national security, and immigration issues in Congress. Jamal holds a BA from the University of Washington in Seattle, majoring in political science with a focus on international relations. Moderating the panel as well as participating will be Stephen Kinzer. He is an award-winning foreign correspondent who has covered more than 50 countries on 5 continents. He was a New York Times foreign correspondent for 20 years and is now a senior fellow at the Watson School of International and Public Affairs at Brown University and a Boston Globe opinion columnist. His books include All the Shah's Men, An American Coup and the Roots of Middle East Terror in 2003. Stephen Kinzer will lead the panel discussion for the first 30 minutes. After that, Itan Mabarak will pose questions sent in by attendees to the panel. If you have any questions for our panel, please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Cole. It's wonderful to be here, particularly with these two deeply experienced scholars and people who follow Iran very closely on a day-by-day basis. I'm here mainly because I want to learn. I'm curious. I want to try to mine the minds of our two expert panelists and try to figure out what's really happening in Iran. And I actually think that most of the people that are watching are in this same position. It's not that we come from a particular perspective, but we want to inform ourselves. So let me start this way. I want to start at the end. Like, let's start from right now, and maybe we can then work our way back. So, the whole world has been riveted by events in Iran over the last couple of months. Now, we all know what happened there. We know that there was an economic crisis, and as a result of this, businessmen, the bazaris, as they're called in Iran, were fed up. They went off into the streets to protest and demand the overthrow of the Islamic regime. They were spontaneously joined by huge throngs of Iranians from all over the country, all focused on trying to depose the government. Uh, Security forces brutally mowed them down, even though there was no violence on the part of the demonstrators. This shocked people in the region who were interested in promoting human rights in Iran, particularly in Israel. And it shocked people on the outside who want to promote human rights in Iran, like the United States and our current government. So we know that's what happened because that's what we've read in every media outlet in the United States. So I'd like to ask the two panelists to assess that version of events, which is the essentially the only version that Americans have gotten, and tell us how true it is and whether there's actually another way to see these events that's richer and more informative and more accurate. Would you like to start, Jamal?
Sure. Thank you, Stephen. And thanks everybody for joining us. I'm sorry we can't be there in person, but next time, hopefully, we won't have the situation we have now. And Stephen, I think hopefully your satire is not missed on people, or your sarcasm is not missed on people. The fact is, we don't fully know what has happened and what is happening. There are a few things I think we do know for certain. And that is that, first of all, thousands of Iranians have been killed. Um, and I think a lot of us are still grappling with just the scale of the atrocity. Um, the baseline for the number of people killed is probably 3,000, which is what the Iranian government will admit to. The most substantially verified numbers. We have been at NIAC, we have been relying on human rights activist network, Harana, because their methodology is probably the strongest that we have seen. It is obviously hamstrung by just the circumstances. And so they are at least doing, a degree of verification that gives some confidence about the numbers. They have been far more conservative than some of the numbers that have been thrown out there. They're saying, I think at this point it's at 6,000 and counting. I think they have said that there are 17,000 cases that are still being evaluated. So the toll of what has happened is still very much being assessed, but we know that thousands have been killed, and um, it's a level of tragedy that Iranians have been befallen by so much of this, so many tragedies, wars, interventions. But this is almost a new level, at least for, people of my generation. And so that's a lot to come to grips with. Now, there are some out there who seem to um, have all of the facts, verified or not verified. And I understand that in a situation like this, it's emotional, it demands action, and so it's understandable that there have been a lot of speculation that has been flying around that is not necessarily verifiable about what the scale is. But when we pair that sort of speculation with overt calls for what to do next, that's when I think that it veers into the lane of propaganda, in which speculation is being treated as fact for the purpose of calling for a foreign intervention into Iran. And I think for us, it's important. We need to acknowledge the tragedy, acknowledge the horrific actions of Iranian security forces, um, and instead of fighting about how bad the toll is, actually be able to have a discussion about what to do next. And instead, there is this intense policing of speech that is happening. We're seeing it in the media, we're seeing it in interviews, we're seeing it, as Cole mentioned, with people trying to cancel events like this. I just received an email, and several others did earlier today, saying if we don't condemn Khamenei on this call, they're going to kill us. As if a condemnation that is delivered uh, under the threat of, of death threats is worth anything. Like, this is exactly what people are so upset about inside of Iran. This sort of dictatorial view that we can't discuss and assess and try to find the right answers does not give me confidence that those who are behind these threats and the policing of discourse, whether it's, various exile opposition groups, the MEK, the monarchists, does not give me much confidence that the interest here is democracy, because that is authoritarianism, that is illiberalism. Now, there are some things we're not allowed to say according to these people. And it is things like the fact that two things can be true at once. The Islamic Republic can be a repressive government. It can be a government that has lost legitimacy among the majority of Iranians, that it has mismanaged the economy of Iran, that Iran faces security challenges now, that the Islamic Republic has to take responsibility for, and that there are multiple crises, from the economy to the ecology, the environment, the water crisis, that squarely must be the Islamic Republic must be held accountable to, or responsible for. That is true, and it can be true at the same time that the United States and various allies, including in particular Israel, have imposed massive sanctions on Iran for decades. And that this situation that we've come to, where Iranians are in the streets and dying in massive numbers, was in fact the plan all along. And that for years, I remember back in 2010, there was the first legislation under Obama to really ramp the sanctions up even further. So for decades, the US had an embargo on Iran. In the 90s, when Iran was attempting some form of sort of economic rapprochement with the rest of the world, the US imposed extraterritorial sanctions on anybody who dealt with Iranian energy. And then in 2010, under Obama, sort of the deal that Obama made domestically, politically, was, I'm going to try to do diplomacy, and if it doesn't work, I will turn to comprehensive, quote unquote, crippling sanctions. When that was being discussed, Iranians were protesting in the Green Movement, saying, "Where's my vote? Where's my voice?" demanding agency. And in the US, you had people like Mark Kirk, like AIPAC, demanding that Obama impose those sanctions. And he did impose those sanctions. Congress passed it. He signed them into law. These are unprecedented sanctions, extraterritorial, sanctioning countries that do any business with Iran. You can't do business with the United States, and so forth. And at the time, advocates were saying, like Mark Kirk, Senator Mark Kirk, the author of the legislation, who was backed by Foundation for Defense of Democracies and AIPAC in writing this. And he openly said, look, I understand that this is going to primarily hurt ordinary people. It may, collapse the middle class, impoverish people. And initially, Iranians may say this is the product of sanctions and foreign powers, and blame the United States. But eventually, they're going to say, I can't feed my kids uranium. I can't feed my kids ballistic missiles. And they're going to turn out in the streets and start blaming the US government. And our response to that was, that is not how a democratic transition works. You don't devastate a society, impoverish a society, collapse the middle class, um, make it impossible for civil society, beyond just the repression that they get internally, to be repressed externally, and then set up a society to actually be able to challenge its rulers. And whether it's through revolution or reform or internal democratic transition, what these sanctions did was collapse the ability for Iranians themselves to have agency. And now, lo and behold, we're at the point that was envisioned from this policy. And for years, we said this is going to lead to war. What is the plan here? How do you expect by weakening Iranians, you're actually going to enable Iranians to realize their aspirations for representation? This is going to lead to war. And they told us, no, this is not going to lead to war. This is, you're crazy, you're chicken little. Now here we are, and we find out, lo and behold, that is the answer. That's the only answer they have. Reza Pahlavi talking about go out into the streets, help is on the way. Okay, what is the plan? Well, U.S. foreign military intervention, war. And that was always the plan. So I feel gut-wrenched for the Iranian people that I think we have failed. And that does not leave the Islamic Republic off the hook. That does not leave anybody else off the hook. But as Americans, our government, to some extent at the behest of Israel, but in coordination with Israel, has brought us to this point and have, instead of building up an infrastructure inside of Iran, enabling Iranians inside of Iran to build up the type of infrastructure you need to seriously challenge a government, to have an alternate in place. Instead of building up that infrastructure, they have built an infrastructure outside of Iran aimed at promoting propaganda and selling the notion that military action is necessary so that the United States and Israel can eventually invade Iran. And that's where we are today. And the fact that we're not able to actually talk about that, I think, demonstrates just how intensely focused these people are on getting that war. They see the light at the end of the tunnel that they've been working for, and they think they're finally there, and they're shutting down all conversations about that. And I hope that policymakers in the US, Congress, others wake up and stop this, because Donald Trump is on the precipice of doing something, I think, that is going to potentially haunt the United States for many generations, haunt the Iranian people for many generations. We're on the precipice of catastrophe. And if we can't even have an honest conversation about how we got here, we can't have an honest conversation about where we go from here.
Well, on that happy note, let me ask Negar, how do you interpret what happened in recent weeks, and how different is the reality you see from what we have been told through our American media?
Thank you so much. Thanks to Mappa, Naya, Cole, and the team. Good to see you, Stephen, Jamal, and for this timely discussion. I wish it was under better circumstances, as Jamal explained. We're meeting after the deadliest crackdown of mass protests, essentially in the history of the Islamic Republic or modern Iranian history. And just to do a very quick recap and trying to not repeat what Jamal has said, the protest started back in December in the heart of Tehran Bazaar with an economic spark, essentially a change in a government, in an economic policy, a certain class of subsidies that impacted a level of merchants in the bazaar, and it led to the devaluation of the Iranian currency and essentially angered that specific class. And if you look at videos of the protests initially, they're literally in the streets of the Tehran bazaar, peaceful protests, not very massive, but sort of very focused. And the government also, interestingly, at the beginning, didn't really take an iron fist crackdown approach. The president himself, the spokesperson of the government, they were trying to say that they're hearing these grievances. They want to listen to them, meet with some of the leaders of the protests. And at some point, we thought that the protests plateaued and were even slowing down. And then came sort of what I see as a second phase, when we saw first President Trump earlier that week tweet that if the Iranian government kills the protesters, the U.S. is locked and loaded to attack potentially and stop the killing. I think that gave a level of a false sense of safety to some Iranians, that if I'm on the street, the regime is not going to kill me because they're afraid of the U.S. attacking. Then also came towards the end of that week, this is the first week of January, came calls from the exiled opposition telling Iranians to get on the street on a specific day, specific time, and calling it the final battle. I think that also, in a way, gave a sort of a sense of feeling that like the regime change, the falling of the regime is imminent. Because when we also see the images and talk to eyewitnesses on the ground, there really was that feeling on the street among people that First of all, people felt like it was a civil war almost situation, the images and some of the experiences that we hear, and that also that this is it, that this regime is about to fall, and this is the final battle, final day or week, and we're going to win. And also of course, the fact that there was a somewhat moderate response and an opening of this space. I think one thing led to another, and the underlying, of course, reason for all of these are layers and years of grievances, economic, political, social, cultural, that just have been piling up. And every time Iranians have these mass protests across the country, they're met with crackdowns. They go back home, but the grievances are not addressed. And so the next time they come back out with more grievances and more anger. And I think that the difference every time with the last time is just that the population felt like nothing got better and they're just angrier. And of course, it was met with a very deadly crackdown. Thousands have been killed, many more injured, many arrested. Now the protests have slowed down, but it's in a space, a post-crackdown space with a very securitized environment, pressure on political activists, on the civil society, and also on those who have been arrested in the course of the protests. And I think we can of course talk about sanctions, the foreign threats, the sort of an external element and all of that. But what happened inside Iran, of course, first of all, is a result of the state of the economy, the deteriorating state of the economy, which has a domestic and an external cause domestically. Of course, something that really angers Iranians is that there's a lot of mismanagement and corruption embedded in the economy. And externally, the country is under severe economic sanctions. It's one of the most sanctioned economies in the world. Every industry in Iran has been sanctioned for years and decades. And that in itself has created the breeding ground and ecosystem for corruption. And just to wrap the sanctions part, essentially, the economy doesn't work for the majority of Iranians, for middle classes, working classes, but it has worked for a small minority of elite within the system or adjacent to the system who have actually profited from sanctions, a class of sanctions profiteers, as we call them, Kasabana Tahrim, and those around them. And so I think that also adds another level of anger. It's not just that Iranians feel like they've gotten poorer and life has gotten more difficult. They also feel this sense of inequality and humiliation that the elite is benefiting from the state of the economy and has gotten more powerful and wealthier and richer. And the average Iranian, the majority, is just not able to meet their needs. But happy to talk about any of these aspects further.
So let me ask this. Jamal painted a kind of chilling scenario of what may be imminent. Now, a number of the countries in the region are worried about the spillover and what could happen if there's upheaval in Iran beyond what we're seeing. They've had the experience of watching what happened to Iraq, watching what happened to Syria, watching what happened to Libya. And they are, I think, in many cases expressing fear and concern about the possibility of military action. So I'd like to ask, are the countries in the region, or is anyone else, looking for diplomatic off-ramps to avoid the kind of catastrophe that Jamal said may be ahead? Jamal, would you like to start and tell
Sure.
us what's happening in regional diplomacy, if anything?
Yeah, I can start and Negar chime in. What the states in the region, especially the Gulf states, are saying is we are going to live with the consequences, not the United States. And I think that there was a real um, so under Obama, there was this view that the United States needed to reduce its role as the mitigator between the Saudis and the Iranians, or the Persian Gulf states and the Iranians, and that they needed to figure out how to share the region. And that needed to come with some measure of independence instead of dependence on the United States. And part of the idea for that was that the nuclear deal was going to sort of bring Iran in from the cold and then force the Iranians and the Arabs to actually work together and figure out some way to have economic interdependence and deal with the security issues. Obama did not manage to do that. I mean, the nuclear deal, he sort of had to pay off the Saudis and the other states with these massive weapons deals as a bribe almost to not tank the JCPOA. Um, Ironically, it was Donald Trump, I think, who managed to change the circumstances in the region where the Saudis and the other Gulf Arab states realized that the U.S. wasn't going to be there if they really needed them. When Iran attacked Saudi oil facilities, when Iran seized ships in the region, when Iran shot down a U.S. drone that there was a debate whether it was in Iran's territory or not, and Donald Trump said he was going to attack targets inside of Iran and then pulled back at the last minute. The signal that was received in the region was that the United States was, sort of a fair weather ally, and that the security of these states couldn't be completely dependent on the United States. They would actually need to figure out a way to coexist with Iran or be ready for, fighting a battle on their own. And so I think that's why we've seen really over the past several years this move, especially by the Saudis and others, to try to form some form of detente with Iran. And they reestablished relations a couple of years ago, and are now warning that, if the United States is going to come in, I don't actually think their concern is necessarily, taking out the Islamic Republic. I think actually they probably would be fine with that if it were actually replaced with something different. But I think there's a recognition that um, that's not as easy as some are making it sound. This is likely to be a very protracted conflict, and sort of, among the best case scenarios, you're going to have a country of over 90 million people. Where there is a refugee crisis, where there's turmoil inside the country, and you have outflows of refugees that potentially dwarf what happened with Syria and refugees flooding into places like Turkey. So I think there's a real interest among the players in the region that actually have skin in the game to avoid this scenario, because they know that the costs are largely going to fall on them unless the United States is willing to put troops on the ground and occupy Iran for many, many years, which I don't think anybody believes is in the offing.
So let me ask Negar, do you see the possibility of diplomatic off-ramps as we approach what could be a military confrontation?
Well, it depends on what day and what time you ask me this. I think the chances, we first heard this is a few weeks ago, a couple of weeks ago, locked and loaded from the president. Then within a week, we heard that the Iranians are contacting him and there would be talks. Within a few days, again, we heard that there will be no talks and that he will attack. And then we heard again that there's an interest for diplomacy. And now we saw the assets, military assets, essentially move to the Middle East, and the posturing looks like there's an imminent attack. And just today, the president talked about a deadline that he's given the Iranians. I think having looked at and reported on this issue since the era of the Barack Obama nuclear negotiations and also under Trump, I think Donald Trump is has always been interested in diplomacy, or essentially maybe not diplomacy, the process itself. That I think is also too long and complicated, but a deal with Iran. I don't think his problem with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, was that the US made a deal with Iran. I think the problem was that Barack Obama made a deal with Iran. And we see that in his comments on the campaign trail both times and when he became president, that essentially, and he's tied it also very closely to a Nobel Peace Prize, how he wants to bring peace and end wars and essentially prevent a conflict with Iran. And he really wants that Nobel Peace Prize, which is also another thing Barack Obama has and he still doesn't. If we don't count the Venezuelan Nobel Peace Prize. But I think it's just he doesn't understand how to deal or how to negotiate or talk to the Iranians. I think his only understanding of negotiations is, and this goes with the brand peace through strength, is that you put pressure and you force the other side to come to the table and essentially surrender or capitulate, and then you get what you wanted. And with the Iranians, this has backfired, I would say, and produced the opposite, because the Iranian brand also, or this Islamic Republic, is that if you put pressure, we will resist. They've even coined it in response to maximum pressure, which is the policy of Donald Trump since his first term. The Iranians have produced what they call maximum resistance. Even today or yesterday, the Iranian foreign minister once again said, we're open to diplomacy, but you have to first remove the threats. Now, I don't know if this is not understood in the White House, or it's just too much, a key part of the brand that it can't. But I think, going back to your question, Stephen, Donald Trump is interested in having a deal with Iran. He just is either not interested or can't focus on the process, which Barack Obama did. Barack Obama, that process was cumbersome. It took 2 years of very intense negotiations. Wasn't just the U.S. and Iran. It was a whole mechanism. And for Donald Trump, initially, in his second term, he said he gave it 60 days. This is something that took 2 years once. You can't do it in 60 days. Believe me, if it was possible, they would. And then the other problem with him and the Iranians is that they didn't start from a blank slate. He started as someone who pulled the US out of the JCPOA and already made deal for all Iranians care. They made a deal with the United States of America. They don't care who was the president, which party. And so for them, it didn't really make sense that the party changed, the president changed, and all of a sudden the US pulled out of the deal and said, we want a different one with you. So it took them a while to realize what was happening. And then came the assassination of the top Iranian general in 2020, which essentially brought the two countries to the brink of war. Then came Joe Biden, who said he would reverse maximum pressure, but didn't. He actually tried to capitalize on it. And now we're hearing also from the voices who were inside that they thought maybe this maximum pressure is actually not a bad idea. And maybe we can essentially do what Donald Trump thought he could do without calling it maximum pressure. So the policy wasn't named, but it really was a continuation. And then the second term came Donald Trump. And I think the Iranians started negotiations with a lot of hesitation and mistrust, but nevertheless, they engaged in 5-6 rounds of negotiations. And then came the June war. And I hope we can talk about the June war a little bit more. But Israel attacked Iran, and then the US attacked Iran while they had a following round of negotiations scheduled for just 2 days after that attack. So I think the mistrust on the Iranian side is very, very deep, especially towards this administration and particularly towards Donald Trump. The other problem was that throughout the process of the negotiation, so on the campaign trail and when the president came last year, he was saying they just can't have nuclear weapons, which is something the Iranians have agreed and engaged under Barack Obama, would engage under Biden, and they said, okay, that's an acceptable framework. But then when they started the negotiations and multiple rounds, the goalpost moved. Suddenly we started hearing from senior officials, and it got higher and higher, that no, they can't have any enrichment, which is a civilian program. This is no longer nuclear weapons. And I think that also really sort of shook the ground under the negotiations. And then it came a time when the special envoy repeated that no enrichment, and the president himself. So I think two issues. One is really understanding the framework that the Iranians operate on and would agree to negotiate. And second, to making clear what you want. I mean, I think if I was telling the Iranians, I would engage and understand that in the negotiating room, but also moving the goalpost while negotiations happen through television interviews and through, appearances is not something that's going to help the process. And in fact, it did hurt it. So I think the chances for diplomacy are very slim and they're narrowing. But I think the interest on both sides for diplomacy, ironically, the interest is very high, but they're just so far away and the gap is so wide that I don't even know if they can meet.
Okay, let's hold it there. We've got questions pouring in, and there's a moderator who's going to look through them and try to pose them to our panelists. I ask you, the two of you, to try to keep your responses brief because we want to get in as many questions as possible. So, Eitan, can you take it from here?
Thank you very much, Stephen. And hi, everyone. My name's Eitan Mubarak. I'm NIAC's organizing manager. And Stephen, of course, you're welcome to answer these too. I know you've done a great job steering the conversation, but you're an expert in it of yourself. So we're looking forward to hear from all of our panelists on these questions. I'll get started and kick off some of our submissions here. Our first question: how do you see the prospect of the United States focusing on covert war combined with further economic siege rather than direct military confrontation? What is the potential for Iran's Syriafication at this moment, and how can we organize against it?
Negar, do you want to start with that one?
Sure, I'll take it up. Um, I think the prospect is not low. I mean, what we saw again, Iran, there has been a communications shutdown in Iran, so we still can't paint a full picture. But speaking to eyewitnesses, people who were on the ground, some have left, some we've talked to in the images, it really felt like a civil war for about a day or two on the streets of Iran. There was a small sort of coordinated, in some areas, even armed element to the protest or the resistance. Of course, not everyone. It was millions of just angry Iranians protesting against the government and their policies, but there was also sort of that layer element, which would be sort of the formula for that situation, potentially a civil war. So it worries me. It also, when you speak to people who war correspondents, I don't know, Stephen, if you've heard this, but who've covered the region for decades, every country in the region, I don't want to name names, but every country in the region who has had a civil war before they had it would look at the other one who had one and be like, we're not going to be like that. And then they would get their civil war. And then comes the next one, we're not going to be like that. And they would get it. And I can name like a domino of five, six neighbors around Iran. So if we look at how it's unfolded by precedent and also foreign intervention, US military intervention in the region. I know there's sort of this utopia or surreal scenarios that people paint as far as the quote unquote help that can come from the outside. But I asked them, show me one example where that help in the form of US military action. And the US has a lot of, tools in its toolbox, but these are all military tools. How would that make the situation any better? How did it make it any better in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria? So it really worries me, and I think potential is high for that form of chaos, and that's why also the neighbors are really worried. That's why Arab countries across the Persian Gulf, Saudis, Qataris, Omanis, the Iraqis to the west, the Turks, everyone's worried, and they're trying to signal to the White House that this is not going to be bound to the borders of Iran. It's going to spill over, and it's going to impact everyone.
Okay. Jamal, if you'll pardon us, can we try to go on to the next question, and then
Sure.
I will ask you to respond?
Sure.
Go ahead, Eitan.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions coming in live, some good ones. I will field one now. Why has there not been a figurehead of the internal resistance other than Pahlavi, human rights activists within Iran?
Let me just make one comment on that subject, and then I'll ask Jamal, who knows that situation much better than I do, to respond. So we hear about a lot of these opposition figures in the United States, but sometimes we overlook the fact that there is a core of amazingly brave civil society activists who have been working for decades through prison sentence after prison sentence to try to promote peaceful change in Iran. And the Nobel Prize winner Narges Mohammadi is one of them. Nasrin Sotoudeh, even the filmmaker Jafar Panahi is now with his new film, which is very, very direct, aimed at the Iranian regime, called It Was Just an Accident. So there's a real group inside Iran that has an idea for how to change that country in a peaceful way. And as I look at those people, many of them women, I'm frustrated that there doesn't seem to be a way for them to participate in this process, so that the whole conflict seems to be between the Islamic Republic and people who want to launch military action, which could create absolute chaos. So, Jamal, what about the possibilities for internal participation in deciding the future of Iran?
So there are a number of factors. The people that you mentioned, and there are others who are, many of whom are in prison, have been in prison for many years. There are many figures inside of Iran who should be raised up much more prominently as people who could actually be part of leading this change internally, which is how change has to happen. Um, Obviously, the repression of the Islamic Republic, putting these people in jail, shutting down civil society networks, things like that, is the primary reason that they have not been able to actually sort of galvanize this movement. The last person to do that inside Iran was, Mir Hossein Mousavi, ran for president. Green movement happened, when the vote was denied, and he's been under house arrest for 15 years now, 16 years. Um, but I would go back to what I said before, which is that, unfortunately, the circumstances outside of the country have only exacerbated that repression. Ideally, you'd have a situation where in Iran where there was at least some degree of prosperity, where you would have a society that was capable of resisting. Look at how the 1979 revolution transpired. We don't have any of those elements right now. The major shock was, the oil strikes, oil workers refusing to actually allow the lifeblood of the economy to function because they were striking in protest of the Shah. You had general strikes because the circumstances were there where you actually had a society that was able to stand up to the rulers. When you have a collapse of the middle class, when you have poverty situations that hollows out civil society, you just do not have those elements in place. And so you end up having um, situations like we have now where it feels like there are no good answers because we are so far behind now. And I think that this is by design. The nightmare scenario for people like Netanyahu is actually not an Islamic Republic that is on the verge of civil war, that is killing its own people, that is impoverished. The nightmare scenario is a strong, powerful, independent Iran, and an independent Iran led by Iranians like Nasrin Sotoudeh, like Nargis Mohammadi, or like there are many others. This policy was designed to strip Iranians of agency and ensure that no independent figure emerged from Iran that was able to stand up to the Islamic Republic, and to instead put Iran in a position where it would be preyed upon by outside powers who would ensure that Iran never rose to the position where they could be a major power in the region, because that is a threat to the worldview of people like Netanyahu. So that's why we are where we are today. And it's so sad. There are no answers. There are no quick solutions. People are asking, well, what can we do? Could there be some targeted strikes? Is there anything we can do to stop this? And I think people like us, we come up with, well, we have to prevent the worst things from happening. But as far as actually empowering Iranians to finally realize, representative government, we are just so many steps behind. And there needs to be a complete reimagining of how we are treating Iran and how we are dealing with Iranian society, because otherwise we are going to be in a situation where the only answers are ones that are going to lead to more killing, more
I would
instability.
love to see the United States engage with those people. Those are the real opposition leaders inside Iran. And it's very frustrating, as you point out, that those people cannot have effect because of the intensity of repression. And to me, that should be part of American policy. Try to talk to the people inside Iran who have devoted their lives to trying to change this situation, rather than always resorting first to military or cyber threats. Okay, I'm sorry, Etan, please go ahead.
No, thank you, everyone. Very pertinent next question here. I wish I could send money to Iranians who are struggling right now. Why can't I?
Jamal, you probably have people who would like to do
So
that too. What do you tell them?
to do what? Sorry.
To
Send
send
money
money.
to people to try
Yeah.
somehow to help people inside Iran.
Again, this is illegal under U.S. sanctions. You can't family cannot legally make transactions. If you want to take money to Iran, you got to figure out how big of a suitcase you want to bring. Most of the time, all the banking channels have been cut off. This is similar to the internet blackout, and I get criticized for saying this because the Iranian government is cutting off the internet. The Islamic Republic is acting in a way that is beyond reproach. And if we had the power to change it, we would do it in a second. But that is not how things work. This is not checkers. This is chess. And so they shut down the internet, and then meanwhile, U.S. sanctions prevent internet tools from coming to Iranians. It's illegal for Iranians to have various, software services, hardware, things like that. Now, some of that has been addressed. There have been general licenses that come to allow for internet freedom, things like that. But it's often too little, too late. And over the course of the last 15 years, Iran has built up its own intranet. So it is able to have an internal internet and more easily cut off the external internet. So all of these factors, and so remittances, sending money to Iran, impossible or very difficult. Even trying to support charity inside of Iran, humanitarian support inside of Iran, support hospitals that are caring for injured protesters. It's all cut off. Iran is on this island that has been created by these sanctions. And so the only way we can actually engage with the Iranian people is by dealing with sanctions and hard power from the outside, and instead of any sort of real engagement that people right now want to be able to take part in.
Eitan, have you got another interesting question for us?
Yeah, we have a few more still coming in. U.S. hegemony is not interested in spreading democracy, even in the USA. Can BRICS coalition help Iran with economic hardships caused by Eurocentric nations?
What do you think, Negar? Is there a prospect for outside groups, even beyond the Middle East, to have some influence?
Not an economist. I mean, I think it's a little bit of an expert question. I think it's one way for Iran to diversify and open, but it's not enough. As Jamal was saying, this is really economic warfare. It's economic strangulation. And I want to, if I can cheat here, Eitan, I also see a question about US military attack, which seems imminent or is getting very serious. We're also hearing from sources and reporting that the president might essentially launch a military attack this weekend. And I think the question many ask is, how would Iran respond? It sounds like Iran's threats are very serious, that they would escalate this time, not try to take an off-ramp. And that's why the neighbors are really worried. But the way I want to tie these things together is that in the June war, essentially, we saw that Iran, as the underdog, was able to hit back much harder than expected, much harder than the Israelis had portrayed that, oh, this is regime change, they're about to fall. We didn't see any regime change activity on the ground. And in fact, we saw the Iranians were able to regroup and hit back and really get to a ceasefire. And the feeling I think that they have after the June war is a sense of somewhat confidence that what didn't kill them maybe made them even stronger, and now they're prepared to go even harder and escalate more. But what I think is really the core weakness is this economic warfare. This is something they haven't been able to deal with. So they've weathered the storm of real war, of the top brass being assassinated, immediately replaced by their deputies or the second layer, and the country really getting back on its feet one way or the other and getting ready for a second war. But the economic warfare, that economic siege, is something that they haven't been able to figure out. It's just gotten worse and worse over the years, and that's what's brought this situation to them. So the Iranians keep talking about how Israel killed over 1,000 Iranians in June, 1,200, most of them civilian. We've seen very horrific images, including children, women. But just in the 2 days of the protest, the crackdown, many, many more were killed. And this is Iranian versus Iranian in an almost civil war format about just 2 days. So, and the core of this is this economic situation. So I think the economy and the sanctions are really what the Islamic Republic has to think about very hard. And it's not just a domestic issue. This is not something they can fix on their own. If they even remove somehow magically all the corruption and mismanagement, without sanctions relief, they can't improve the economy. And without an improvement of the economy, they can't deal with this domestic crisis. It's just going to get worse. And so to get that sanctions relief, they have to think hard. and shift some gears and policies to be able to engage with the U.S. and in meaningful and serious diplomacy.
I think that makes sense that without foreign policy changes, it's hard to see how the economic situation is going to improve. Okay, Eitan, what's next?
Yes. So this question is considering that part of the reason people get drawn toward far-right populism is the passiveness of the global left, what should we plan to do to really show the people that when we say the US must not interfere, we also have a solution for then how we support the people? Um,
Now
the
that's a
left,
tough one,
yeah.
Jamal. How do we find a way to support Iranian people? This is what, of course, the Americans and the Israelis say they're doing. But how could we do it in a more authentic and genuine way? Is there in this complex of sanctions and cutoffs of communication channels, is there some way that people on the outside can express more than just verbal solidarity with people inside Iran?
Yeah, it's a really important question and a difficult one because, as I said, these building blocks, every step of the way, you've got people on the left or people like us saying, don't, this is a bad policy. This is going to hurt Iranians. This is going to isolate them. And they just keep building up and building up. Now we're in this position where a mass atrocity has happened and the escalation ladder for the United States is already at the top rung. There's no new sanction. I mean, they're doing sanctions designations that are meaningless because Iran is already completely sanctioned. Every official is completely sanctioned. The only thing left to do, if you listen to them, is military strikes. So it's very unsatisfying to just sit here and say, well, we need to undo all of the bad policies that have undermined Iranians as a first step, because that doesn't really speak to the urgency of the moment. And I think that, I'm frustrated by some of the discourse that says the left is passively sitting here and by by laying some of the blame on external policies and US sanctions and things like that, you're actually uh, engaging in your own form of colonialism or Orientalism by denying the agency of Iranians or even the agency of the Iranian government in this. And to that, I just say naming imperialism, naming how sanctions rob people of their agency, naming it is not exacerbating it. We're calling it out because that is exactly what these policies do. And so don't criticize us for naming what these policies actually do.
I would
Um,
just let me add one other little point, and maybe you want to comment on this. When I hear the formulation, "What can the left do?" I ask myself, why should we be limiting ourselves to the left? Actually, non-intervention is a conservative idea.
right.
Anybody who believes in conservative policies would never support this kind of pressure on a foreign country that poses no imminent threat to American interests.
Yeah.
So, to me, limiting the discourse to what the left would do cuts out a huge number of people who actually have no sympathy with leftist ideas, but don't want the United States to become the policeman of the world.
Yeah. That's completely right. And really, so there is legislation in Congress uh, to prevent Donald Trump from waging this war, and the champion of it is Republican Thomas Massie. Now, a lot of the energy on the right, the anti-interventionist energy, has not necessarily translated into institutional power. Not that it has so much on the left or the Democratic side, but I think what's happening on the right is very interesting. That you do have this phenomenon. That being said, going back to what is the solution? What do we do? I mean, I also look at some of the tools that have been so badly eroded. I mean, in a situation like this, ideally, there be some international law in place to actually hold people accountable for this stuff. Thousands of Iranians killed by their own government. Unfortunately, we've seen how international law functions when mass atrocities or genocides are undertaken. So we've seen the hollowing out of international law, and not that it started with Biden, but this particular inflection point where it just seems, people are talking about Trump is going to form his own UN, because of how irrelevant international law has become, and it's just makes right. So we look to, okay, what are the international multilateral mechanisms that can actually be used to deal with this? What is the system that was set up after World War II to deal with situations like this? And it's been completely eroded. So we are supporting, we need a fact-finding mission, and the UN has a fact-finding mission. The UN has special rapporteurs to, at a minimum, get the facts so that there can then be accountability. And that is something that nobody is talking about. The designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, which the US did many years ago, so it's a symbolic move by Europe, but the impact is probably pretty negligible, is getting far more attention than the fact that the UN voted to extend the fact-finding mission to actually investigate and have accountability. Who did this? Who are the figures behind this? Let's actually, let's use international law to hold them accountable. That has been, kind of completely ignored. But I just think, the bottom line is we have to figure out every question has to be how do we, first of all, do no harm, get out of the way of the people, and how do we empower people? Like there's talk about some of the things that can be done on internet connectivity. There's Siphon and other tools that are being used. There needs to be a serious effort around this instead of these sort of superficial efforts that are just like, well, the regime's bad, let's just bomb them and hopefully things turn out okay.
Okay, Eitan, what have you got next for us?
All right. Stephen, a question that's come in addressed to you. Since Stephen knows this subject well, I'm wondering why in the aftermath of the 79 revolution, it did not result in civil war. Yet this time, most of the videos from within Iran show protesters chanting the same slogans. They don't seem to be ethnic or attacking each other. What would cause them to go into war with each other? What would cause civil war in Iran?
First of all, I think Iranians have learned a painful lesson that people in other countries have learned somewhat less painfully. And that is that no matter how bad the situation is, it can get worse. The one thing that united all the different disparate groups that came together in 1978 to overthrow the Shah's regime was this belief. We don't agree with each other. We don't know what comes next, but for sure, it's going to be better than what we had. So Iranians have learned a lesson that that's not a good way to proceed. As for the possibility of Iran actually splitting up and descending into civil war, I think it is a possibility, but only if fomented intently from the outside. There are minorities, the Kurds, the Azeris, Arabs. Those groups could be utilized by outside forces. This has happened repeatedly in other countries. So if the outside powers that are truly interested in turning Iran into a pit of chaos are looking for tools to do that, then I think supporting ethnic separatism would be the logical thing they're doing. I think there's a certain amount of this already going on. And I don't believe that those forces themselves would risk the unity of their country by pushing it into civil war, but outside powers could push them to do that. And that to me is the one scenario that I think could produce real civil conflict inside Iran. Negar, does that make sense to you?
Yes, sure. Just to the point that the previous point, also Jamal, on the other side, Senator Rand Paul and Tim Kaine introduced this bipartisan war powers resolution. Also to your point, Stephen. One other thing, if I can add another layer, is that sort of this dichotomy, I think a false dichotomy or polarity that has been created that you're either with this regime or you're without it. If you're not with them, then how come you don't expect this help or you don't support this help from the outside? And I know a lot of people on the ground in Iran who are living through this hardship, this economic hardship, middle classes, working classes, who don't welcome this form of foreign military power, not because they're benefactors of the status quo, not because they're sanctions profiteers or by any means the elite. In fact, they are very much opposed to the status quo, but they don't feel like they're at a place of having nothing to lose, because you see the sort of raw anger on the street, a lot of young people, lots of men who come to the street really with their lives on the front line, in a sense that you feel like this person just has nothing else to lose. It can't possibly get worse for them. But there's also a very large population, there's silent observers who don't come on the street because they don't want to risk their lives. In this gray area, who don't benefit from the status quo, but they also don't want to be the next Libya, and they have very legitimate concerns of where this would end up. They want to see a free, democratic Iran with good governance, no corruption, a thriving economy that connects with the world. But they also don't see foreign U.S. military intervention really leading them to that future anytime soon, and they're more worried about the actual examples that they see around them in the neighborhood. So I just want to also really make space for that third sort of part, which I think is a very large population and is watching all of this with worry.
Etan, do we have time for one more question?
Yes, I think we do. So we have discussed some of the internal activists and folks in Iran, including Nasrin Sotoudeh and Mousavi and some of the statements and things that are coming out from folks in Iran. But can you again speak to the prospect of what a viable transition away from the current status quo looks like, and give some reflections on opposition figures like Reza Pahlavi, and whether you see him as a feasible transition leader?
So how we get from here to where we want to be? That is a real big question. You want to start, Jamal?
Yeah. So we are seeing inside of Iran these statements from figures that are going beyond what they've said in the past in terms of demanding for change, calls for a national referendum, joint calls among leaders inside of Iran and figures outside of Iran. And so I think those are important. How you translate those calls into the type of power to actually effectuate what they're calling for, I think is a very tough question, and is made even more difficult by the fact that there were protests and then immediately there were threats of outside military intervention that I think helped to securitize the situation and foment this crackdown. And so now I think in this environment, it's very difficult for those civil society actors to be able to actually mobilize and do anything serious. And I think there's this maybe unfounded, but this speculation that, these exile figures like Pahlavi are actually the type of opposition that the Islamic Republic really prefers, that it's sort of top down, sort of superficial. There's not a real structure, certainly not a structure inside of Iran, but even very limited organization outside of Iran. And so to have somebody who is, going to visit Israel during and meet with Netanyahu and sort of openly beg for imperial powers to invade Iran, that this is actually very advantageous to the Islamic Republic, because that is not a threat. Now, if that is then able to leverage external powers to make war, well, that becomes a threat, but it's not an Iranian threat, and it's an external threat. The real threat to them are actors inside the country that can actually build organizations to challenge the structure. And so I think this is just something we need to keep an eye on and identify ways to build more space for those actors to demand these changes. That is what we should, and we need to uplift those voices, because there is a concerted effort, whether it's Iran International or some of these opposition figures, to silence those voices. Look at all the attacks that Nargis Mohammadi got from outside of Iran, supposedly from Iranians in the diaspora, because she hadn't sworn allegiance to Reza Pahlavi. That is really harmful for any effort to actually build a structure inside of Iran if you're getting attacks from outside of Iran, warning people not to uphold those figures. So we need to pay attention to what people inside of Iran are actually saying and calling for.
And it seems to me that as long as the Iranian regime is facing daily threats of military action and direct violent intervention, it's very difficult to see how they would open space and allow some of these nonviolent civil society figures to emerge. So if we want them to emerge, reducing the imminent threat might be the best thing we could do. Negar, would you like to have a last word on that?
Yeah, just exactly what you are saying. What the combination of sanctions and also these threats have really led to a hardening of that core, hardline, more conservative part of the state and weakened the moderates, the reformists, and the civil society. First of all, it's made the civil society poorer. Civil society usually comes from the middle class, working class people who, once they have to worry about bread, can no longer worry about democracy and, the civil society activism. And then also this pressure has closed the political space for any activity inside the country. And anyone who's shown any viable, capacity for leadership has been put under pressure by the system, because this is a system that itself came of a popular revolution. So they know how to reverse engineer and see how those networks are taking shape and to prevent it from happening.
Well, I don't think we've come up with any magic solutions, but I definitely think many of the people who are watching will share my gratitude to these expert panelists who've tried to give us some new insights beyond what we're getting from our media. I want to thank the organizers. This is just the kind of thing we need to do because Americans need to understand what's being done in our name and try to change a policy that is actually self-defeating. Just like our intervention against Mossadegh in 1953 and like so many other interventions in the world, it not only harms the target country, but it undermines the security over the long run of the intervening country. So how do we get out of this box? We don't have a final answer, but I think we have a better perspective now than we did an hour and a half ago. So I really appreciate both of you and your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to add my thanks to the panelists and to everyone who attended to participate in this discussion, those who sent in questions and made comments. Just today, we heard that Senator Tim Kaine and Rand Paul have introduced a war powers resolution on Iran in the Senate. If you wanted to express your opinion on that matter to your senator, you might want to get in touch because some of the signals indicate that an attack might be coming pretty soon. Thank you, everyone. And I should mention that we're going to send an email to all those who registered for this event with a link to the video. So you can watch the video and you can share it with far and wide. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.